G'day poker people, welcome back. After missing about the first third of December, the race was on to make sure I got the 50 hours of volume playing 1-3 at Derby and collect that $500 bonus. The other race was on to also get my win rate back above $60 an hour because after a pretty brutal downswing in the month of November, we have definitely gone back on the uptick, but we're still not there, still chasing that magic $60 an hour mark. So I was back in on a Sunday afternoon and I had to wait an hour for a new 1-3 game to open, but patience is a virtue. Finally get into the game at about 1 p.m. and I was ready to grind out some volume. So let's not waste any more time, see what happened in the session, and let's go. So after a pretty gross wait, we are finally in the 1-3 streets for 1,000 bangers. Really don't like having to wait long to get in a game. It just sort of takes away a lot of my prime, like freshness, and maybe puts me on tilt a bit. So maybe that's something to consider going forward and just watch out for a bit of tilt. Whatever the case though, I am definitely somewhat untilted because we do have an under the gun straddle on for this hand, and then I'm under the gun with ace queen offsuit. I raise it up to 20 and then I get called by a passive big blind as well as a passive straddle. So you love raising under the gun and still getting to play the pot in position. So we're three ways to a flop of ace king 10 with two hearts. When the villains check it over to me, definitely want to go ahead and bet this hand for value in position to two passive opponents. This is probably the best street to get value on with this hand from worse stuff. So I go ahead and make it 25, and then the big blind folds, but the straddle does call. So we're heads up to a turn, which is the queen of clubs. Pretty happy to make two pair because I actually think the villain has a bunch of worse two pairs on this board. So when they check it over to me, definitely want to go ahead and bet for value to try and get something from the worst two pairs, which will likely be somewhat scared off on this four-liner to a jack here. And if I do go ahead and bet here and my opponent raises, I almost know for certain that they have a jack. So good spot to go ahead and bet and see where the opponent's at. I decide to size to 40, and then the villain throws in the call. So very happy to not get raised here. Very confident we do have the best hand until the river is the 8 of hearts, putting in the front door flush draw. Now I do not like this. I think a lot of my opponent's worst calls on the turn are going to be flush draws, but they also have some two pairs. So when they check it over to me again, I think a small bet here will still get paid off by the worst two pairs. And versus a passive opponent, I think in general, when passive opponents do call down with their flush draws and they get there on the river, they're very likely to just go ahead and lead a flush. So I think their frequency of having flushes is definitely less. It is absolutely not zero. They could definitely check a flush on the river. I just think it's a little bit less likely against a passive opponent. So in my opinion, this is a good spot to bet for thin value. I decide to go ahead and make it 50. And then the villain rips it all in for 165. So I think I ran into one of the spots where the opponent did not lead their flush on the river and they've checked and raised me with it. No chance they're bluffing when they're only ripping it for such a small bet. So I think we do have a pretty easy fold with the ace queen here, and I stay disciplined and muck the ace queen, and happy that I made the disciplined fold on the river. I also like my thin value bet on the river as well, but yeah, just not running the hottest to start off this session. So let's try and get some momentum back in this next hand. There are 5 open limbs before the action's on my big blind with ace-8 of hearts. I think we already have a pretty interesting decision here, whether we want to ISO raise it up or whether we want to just check and take a free flop. Really could go either way. I think at a tighter, more fold-happy table, I would like raising, and vice versa if the table is more call happy, just check it and try and flush over flush someone. I decide that this is a bit of a tighter table on a Sunday afternoon at Derby in the 1-3, so I raise it up to 35, and maybe my read was bad because I get called by 3 separate people. So really not loving that news. We are the first one to act multi-way, and the flop is King 9-3 with 2 hearts though, so we do make the nut flush draw. As usual, when I'm out of position in a multi-way pot, I do like to check my entire range, and the nut flush draw is no exception in my opinion. So I check it, and action actually checks all the way to the button, who goes ahead and bets 50. Then I'm next to act, and I think we have a pretty clear-cut call here. I think the button betting into so many people. His range is pretty strong, and I don't think he's going to fold to a check raise unless he does have a worse flush draw, which is a hand we do not want folding. Going to make a lot of EV by flush over flushing someone. So I think it's a pretty easy call here, which I decide to do. And then the passive under the gun player calls and then the other player gets out of the way. So we are 3 ways to a turn, which is the 9 of spades pairing middle pair. It's not a heart, so we're not in love with this one. I go ahead and check it over under the gun, who checks it, as does the button. So we do get a free river. Fingers crossed it's a heart, because I think the chances we'll flush someone is pretty likely now that the turn's checked all the way through. And then the river is the jack of spades. No, that is not a heart, and don't really want to bluff it. I think if either of the opponent checked a king on the turn, there's not really any bet they'll fold to. Maybe all in, but I don't think it's worth that risk in case they do have a full house, which is actually somewhat possible as well, that we check on the turn, trying to let flush draws get there. So pretty easy check, and maybe take a bit of showdown value with ace high. So I check it. Under the gun player goes ahead and bets 100. The button calls, and I have a pretty easy fold here. Give the opponent a lot of credit for king X and maybe some full houses as well. And then I fold, and then the under the gun player shows ace 9 of clubs. So he actually had trips, and the button shows king 8 of diamonds. So no, we would not have flush over flush someone, but at least we kind of lost the minimum with how we played it post flop. But yeah, pre flop, just a bad read that the table would limp fold a bunch. This next hand gets a bit spicy, so let's see how it goes. I'm in the cutoff with pocket fives. I raise it up to 15, and then I get called by an aggressive button and a tight aggressive big blind calls as well. So we go 3 ways to a flop of queen 6-3 rainbow. So don't hit our set, not in love with that when the big blind checks it over to me. I think we have a pretty easy check here. Try to get to a turn for as cheap as possible. And then the aggressive button goes ahead and bets 25. The big blind folds. Now the action's back on me, and being that the opponent is loose aggressive, I think they're going to have a bunch of weak stabs on this flop, and I kind of want to attack that here. I mean, most of his hands that fold to a check raise are going to be lower showdown value than pocket fives, but still worthwhile doing for equity denial. And if my opponent does have like pocket sevens or pocket eights, I really don't think they're going to call the check raise, but even if they do, we can get them off with continued streets of barreling. So I go ahead with the check raise. I make it 110, and then the button calls. Not quite what we wanted to see. And the turn is the king of hearts, which maybe will be a scare card to my opponent's pocket pairs worse than queen X. Even queen X is a bit of a scary turn card, but I think my opponent does have king queen offsuit pure in their range, so they definitely have more nutted hands on this turn. And then before I can act, the opponent actually checks out of turn. Now, when the opponents check out of turn, it's one of two things. Either they're just like disengaged from the hand and want it to go over as quickly as possible because their hand's weak, or they are trying to angle shoot and induce action with a check, trying to represent the aforementioned, oh, I don't care about the hand. I think since I check raised on the flop and this pot is kind of getting big for a 1-3 game, the chances that he is doing the latter to try and angle shoot is a lot more likely, because I feel like he'll kind of be dialed in now that the pot's over 200 in a 1-3 game. But in case I'm wrong about that, I kind of want to mix in a smaller stab here, see what the opponent does, and if they do call, then we'll know they're probably more likely doing the angle shooty thing, but we get to find that out for a cheaper price. So I decide to go ahead and bet for 100. If my opponent didn't check out a turn, I probably would have used a larger size here. So yeah, if he's trying to angle me for a cheaper showdown, then he's achieved that, but I don't think that's what he's trying to do. I think he's just trying to represent weakness because either he has a really strong hand or he just has absolute bullshit that wants to give up. So I decide to find out. I go ahead and bet 100, and then the button calls, and when he calls, I know he's pretty strong here. So when the river's the 7 of spades, I'm just going to give up on my bluff at this point. I think my opponent probably has king queen, or maybe a hand even stronger, maybe ace king potentially as well. So I just check it over to them, and then they go ahead and bet 300. So yep, I definitely think they were trying to angle shoot on the turn by checking out a turn. I have a very easy fold here, and yeah, I usually you should be mad at people for angle shooting you, but he kind of made it obvious what he had, and I feel like I lost the minimum, even if maybe my over-aggressive bias is showing a bit with a check raise on the flop. So despite some good plays, really not running the hottest this session, let's try and turn things around in this next hand. I'm in the cutoff again with ace 4 offsuit. I raise it up to 15, and then a tight aggressive button calls. So it heads up to a flop of king 8-7 rainbow, when the action's on me, out of position with a semi-showdown value hand in this spot. I think we have a pretty clear-cut check, and the button agrees as well because they check it back. So it heads up to a turn, which is the 7 of spades pairing bottom pair. Now, I want to mix in a bit of a stab here. The chances we have the best hand with ace high is pretty likely, but if my opponent does have a stronger hand like a pocket pair that's worse than 8x, for example. I don't think they're really going to be able to call that much. You just sort of don't want to check it down and then like accidentally lose a hand to pocket threes when it would have folded. So I mix in a bit of a stab here. I go ahead and bet at 15, and then the button calls pretty quickly. So now we're heads up to a river, which is the 4 of spades. So it does give us a bit of showdown value here. Now we do beat pocket threes if we call with that on the turn. So I think it's a good spot to go ahead and check it over to the villain, see what they do. And then they go ahead and bet 45. Now when they bet this much, I think their range will consist of a few 7x, although I think those hands might have at least considered raising on the turn, maybe a few flushes, but we do have the ace of spades, so it's a lot less likely. I think the majority of their range is going to be like a king x, maybe a pocket tens going for thin value. I just don't think those hands are going to be able to call a check raise here when the backdoor flush gets in. So I think this is a good spot to bluff. We have the ace of spades as well. That definitely doesn't hurt. So I go ahead and check raise it to 300, really trying to fold out single pair hands. And then the button snap folds. So maybe our bottom pair was good anyway, but we do get a bluff through and we finally win a hand this session. Let's go. G'day poker people, I'm here today to tell you about my new favourite app that is helping me improve my game day by day, and it is the Fastroll Poker app. Essentially what it is, it's a hand history tracker for live poker players, something akin to Poker Tracker for online poker, but they're bridging the gap and they're making it for live players and following a very user-friendly, intuitive software. You can input the hand histories literally right after you're done playing them in a matter of seconds. It takes me about 15 to 30 seconds after I've played each hand, and they're stored on a database inside the app. And the beautiful thing about that is after the session's over, I can go back and look over the hands I've played and see what I'm doing well, and more commonly where I've punted off a lot of money, and thus helping me know what the leaks in my games are and then how I can plug them. So I cannot recommend this app strongly enough if you are a serious poker player. I've been offered many sponsorship deals in the past from things I think were a bit shady. This is the first thing I actually wanted to promote because I think it is actually a very good tool which will help you guys actually improve your poker game. So if you want to try it out, use the code LEEBETS when you purchase an annual subscription and you'll get the first month free. If you don't like it after the first month, you're totally fine to cancel without charge, but I really think you guys are going to love this app and can't recommend it strongly enough. It's a massive tool to help your game. So use the code LEEBETS on an annual subscription and you'll get the first month free. For now though, let's fast roll back into the gambling. Let's hope things are turning around a bit and we're able to ride that momentum going forward. This hand I'm on the button with 3-2 suited. Definitely a looser open on the button, but in a 1-3 game where you rarely ever get 3-bet, I think it's a fine hand to open. So I go ahead and make it 15 and then a tight aggressive small blind calls. And we're heads up to a flop of King 9-8 with 2 spades and 1 heart. When the small blind checks it over to me, we have 3 high. So if we get any folds here, we are absolutely laughing. So I decide to mix in the stab. I go ahead and make it 15 and then the small blind calls. So still heads up to a turn, which is the Queen of Hearts, giving us the 3 high flush draw. But then things get interesting when the small blind actually leads out for 10. Now, when they lead out for such a small sizing, I think the majority of their range is going to be Queen X. Would make a lot of sense that they're going for thin value with, but also draws. I think like if they had spades or hearts, it's like pretty likely that they would lead out with those hands. So that makes me kind of want to raise here and then bluff them off of their draws on the river. Sort of like bluff value betting the turn and then with a plan to bluff on the river. It's definitely on the fancier play side of things, and if my read's wrong about my opponent leading for a small size here and they're just doing it with the nuts, we're kind of punting off a bit into a strong range, but whatever the case, still think it's a good spot to do it. Targeting my opponent's draws and weak pairs for value, planning to bluff them on the river, so I go ahead and raise it up to 70, and then the small blind 3-bets to 160, and I'm like, well shit, I guess my read was wrong. It's pretty likely that they do have Jack 10 offsuit, and even if they don't and they are 3-betting a draw, it could be backdoor hearts, in which case we are drawing almost dead. Actually, often we are drawing dead if they have a pair as well. So I think unfortunately we just have to lay down this hand and throw our equity out of the window in this one. And the villain got us good with a small lead, because if they led bigger we probably would have just called and had a better chance to realize our equity. So yeah, maybe I called it too soon when I said the momentum on the session was turning around. This next one's a juicy one. So I'm in the hijack with King Jack of clubs, open it up to 15. Then the action's round to a tight aggressive small blind who 3-bets to 70. Being that we're about 1,000 effective with the villain, I think we're getting a decent price to call and play this pot in position. Wouldn't hate a fold here since this hand is often dominated by the plethora of ace-king combinations in my opponent's range, but I think the price point is just spot on. Like, I might have folded to 75 and I think 65 is a snap call, so I think it's right in the middle, but I decide to call here, which I think is a fine play. Whatever the case, we are heads up to a monotone flop of 7-5-3 with hearts, not clubs, unfortunately, but then the villain checks it over to me, and now I definitely want to start betting at this pot. I think my opponent is probably going to call on the flop with all of their ace-king and ace-queen combinations, but they're not going to be able to call on the turn. And even if my opponent is trapping with like pocket aces, this is a pretty scary board for aces, particularly if they don't have a heart. So I'm not actually convinced that a tight aggressive opponent is going to want to stack off on this board with pocket aces. So if we are going to bluff, we need to start doing it now. So that's what I do. I go ahead and bet 60, and then the small blind throws in the call. So we're still heads up to a turn, which is the 8 of clubs. The villain checks it over to me again. I think it's absolutely a mandatory second stab here. My opponent is going to have all the world of natural folds with our ace-king and ace-queen combinations. And as I mentioned on the flop, even if they are trapping with an overpair, it's a scary board for it. It just got scarier. They lose to pocket 8, 7, 8 now. So I definitely want to keep in mixing a bluff here. That's what I do. I go ahead and size it to 120, leaving a little bit over the size of the pot left behind for us to go all in on the river on. So I go ahead and make it 120. Then the small blind goes all in for 870. So I really was not expecting that. I honestly think when they do this, their range is most likely like the ace of hearts, king of spades, for example, or just a mate flush. They just flopped a flush and I'm taking a strong line and they're trying to stack my sets and my two pairs. When we have king high, we have the easiest fold in the world since we actually do lose to their bluffs. But yeah, it's just more of us being very aggressive and it's just costing us money in this session. So this session has not been going our way. It feels like nothing's working except for that one bluff we got through, but hopefully things change around in this next hand because a passive player limps under the gun and it falls to my small blind where I peel. Pocket queens. This is the type of hand we wanted to see to try and turn things around. I go ahead and ISO raise it to 20 and then the under the gun player calls. So it heads up to a flop of 10-9-9 rainbow. Definitely not the best flop in the world. The opponent is going to have way more 9x combinations than us, and being that we're out of position, I do like checking as a default anyway, but particularly on this board. So I check it over to the villain who does check back. Now feeling very confident that we do have the best hand here. So when the turn's a 6 of diamonds and the board just gets even more wet, any 7 or any 8 is a straight draw, and I don't think the villain is ever going to fold any of those hands. I definitely want to mix in a bet here, try and build this pot and get value from those hands. I go ahead and make it 25, then the villain calls. So we're loving that we're getting value here until the river is the 7 of hearts. Absolutely gross river. We now lose to pocket 7s, pocket 8s, 7-8. If my opponent had like ace 8 of diamonds, we just lose to so much on this river that I really don't think we can bet and get called by a worse hand, in all honesty. Maybe if the opponent checked the flop with like ace 10, we could get called by that hand, but I think it's way too narrow of a range, and I think that hand bets on the flop often enough that we just can't value bet here. So I just check it over to the opponent and like fingers and toes crossed that my opponent just checks back, which they do not. They go ahead and bet 65, and I just end up snap folding my queens here. The chances they have an 8 are very likely, and if they don't have an 8, they probably have a full house. So I snap fold my queens, and then the opponent shows 8-7 of diamonds. They actually had the open-ended straight flush draw on the turn, as well as the mate straight on the turn. So yeah, we do end up losing the minimum for this one, which is good, but just nothing had been going my way this session, and I think it was time for me to leave before I started to tilt. There you have it. Those were the most interesting hands we played in this 5-hour, 10-minute session. Things definitely didn't go my way. I think I was on the dog end of bad variance. Maybe I'm biased when I say that, but I do think that I mostly ran bad for this session. There definitely were some over-aggressive and bad bluffs I made this session, which I absolutely have to own up to and take accountability for. Taking the bait and raising with the 3-2 suited on the turn after even deciding to V-pip that hand in the first place. The pocket 5s check raise, yeah, it's probably a bit of spew in all honesty, and it seems like I defaulted to the aggressive option in a bunch of different spots where I probably didn't need to. the ace-8 suited raise pre-flop, for example. Just, yeah, definitely a bit of over-aggression bias. And I think after I played the session yesterday, I just didn't get a good night's sleep before coming in. And on top of that, I had to wait an hour before getting in the game. I think that tilted me a little bit. And when I'm tilted, I definitely gravitate more so towards aggressive lines, which I think was the case today. And also, I did like some of the aggressive lines I took and had some good discipline folding the pocket queens on the river. So not totally in the dirt with my gameplay grade, but it's definitely nothing to be too impressed about. I'm going to give myself a C+ for today's session. I think it's why I ended up having a losing session, lost 775 on the session, which is really going to hurt the challenge. I've actually fallen below $50 an hour at this point, and you hate to see it because I was so close. I was at $59 an hour. I was so close to getting back up to the $60, but now we've had yet another little mini downswing in the past 2 sessions, and now it feels like we're a big dog for the challenge again. So I am going to need to rally to get my numbers back up to make the $60 an hour. Fortunately, we've still got a bunch of sessions left in the month to try and get to that point. Make sure you hit subscribe and you'll get to see the next session out when let's see if we can turn things around there. For now though, I'm out of here. Viston la tasha.